This is an introduction to the waves model of thinking about feminist history. This is a discourse or a story that describes feminist history. What are the waves? The first wave broadly goes from 1848 to 1920. The main focus of the first wave is women's suffrage, that's the right to vote. The second wave goes from the 1960s to the 1980s. Second wave mainly focuses on institutions, equal pay, Roe v. Wade, the right to choice, so forth. The third wave, which is the one we're focusing on in this class, starts in the 1990s and arguably is still going on today. Strengths of the wave model. I rather like the metaphor of the waves because feminist activism has been continuous, but you have these moments where it surges up much like a wave, whilst at the same time there's this continuous ocean. It also indicates the kind of formlessness of the waves. You can't find a precise beginning and end of a wave, but rather it comes out of an ongoing system. The waves model is also widely used. You'll hear a lot of people refer to it, so it's important to have a sense of what they're talking about. I actually don't like the waves model. I don't use it as prominent in my Women's 100 introductory class. It has a number of important weaknesses. Broadly speaking, it fails at intersectionality. It's a very US-centric model. There has been activism all over the world and in every country by women for their rights, including suffrage movements in every country, and these happen sometimes more or less the same time as the US waves, but often at very different times, some of them earlier, some of them later, some of them shorter, some of them longer, and so it really doesn't describe the feminist movements of internationally, it just looks at the US movements. Second, it's a very white middle class centric model. There has been feminist activism from women of color, from working class women, but when we're talking about the waves, we're mostly talking about the activism of white and middle class women. That's obviously a big problem. Even by white and middle class women, there's activism outside the waves. For example, there was plenty of feminist activism in the 1930s, but we don't talk about that much because of the waves model kind of says that it didn't happen. So it ignores activism done by people who weren't during these time periods and ignores activism done by people and surges of activism done by people who weren't part of the mainstream white middle class feminist movements. It also minimizes difference within the waves. When we talk about the first wave, for example, as a movement for women's suffrage, we ignore the work of feminists like Emma Goldman, who focused on an anti-state or an anarchist viewpoint for women's liberation, and talked about, for example, the work of rights of sex workers, something we typically associate with the third wave. We also ignore the cultural importance of the first wave in writings like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein when we talk about the third wave as being the focus of feminist culture. So there's a lot of diversity within the waves of thought that get minimized by trying to describe them in a simplified way. At the same time, it minimizes similarities between the waves. As I said, the feminist activism that rejects the state, it rejects liberal institutions as a means to advance or a means to women's rights, has happened since the beginning, and yet when we talk about that activism, we typically only talk about it in the third wave. Similarly, African American women have been active in fighting for their own rights as long as they have been in this country, but when we use the waves movement, because it focuses on white middle class women, we tend to ignore the activism done by African American women, which has been continuous during all of these waves periods. So for me, the waves model has a lot of weaknesses. The main reason that I am talking about it here is because it's in the title of the class. And this looks at third wave feminism. And because it is a model that people think about when they're doing feminist organizing, people use this term, third wave feminism, to refer to contemporary feminism and to think about the ways in which this new feminism is different from the feminist movements of the 1960s, the feminist movements of the 1900s. So it can be useful if you prefer, which I do, you might just want to think about talking about this current wave of feminism as contemporary feminism or modern feminism or feminism that's going on right now, has been for the past 20 years. So that's how this class is constrained. We're mostly going to be looking at feminism since about 1990, and the term that's often used for that is third wave feminism. It's a problematic term, but it's one that's commonly used.